In this video, we're going to look at the literary structure of the flood, at least in brief, in order to investigate the question of whether or not the biblical text states that the flood was a global event, a regional event, or whether or not there is enough in the text to make that determination. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so let's look at the literary style of the flood, and you'll find the flood account in the biblical text within Genesis chapters 6 through 8. It does bleed into chapter 9 a little bit, but scholars have long recognized that the flood account is written in what is known as chiastic structure, or a chiasm, which is a literary device in which a sequence of ideas is presented and then repeated in reverse order. So you can see here on the screen, I've got this A, B, C, D, and then it descends in reverse order on top of itself, C, B, A. That is an example of a chiasm, or what chiastic structure would look like. However, we've got a little bit better example. We can actually examine the flood account, but this is just looking at the period of days that are mentioned in the flood. They actually form a chiasm. And so you can see up top here, you have your 7 days of waiting, followed by another 7 days, and then you get the 40 days up to the 150. And then you have this central point where God remembers Noah, and then it reverses back on itself, 150 days, 40 days, and then finally 2 periods of 7. This particular structure of the chiasm is actually a shortened version, again, just looking at the numbers within the flood narrative, taken from Old Testament scholar Gordon Wenham's work. And if you are curious as to other views of the form of the chiasm, I'll actually link some useful books and commentaries that I've looked at to give you an overall idea of where scholarship falls on this. The flood narrative is also a decreation story. So if you think back to the cosmic creation story in Genesis chapter 1, where God, his spirit is hovering over the chaotic water, the flood account is actually those chaotic waters coming back over the land. But this is designed to bring you back to Genesis 1, and ultimately it's an invitation to follow a single family. Genesis deals a lot with seed language, and specifically the seed that comes from Eve and also the line of Adam. And so you have this Adam to Noah figure. So you're supposed to be paying attention to this lineage and this line. There's a scholar by the name of Dr. Stephen Scott out of Concordia University in Canada who wrote a fantastic article. I'll throw a link and a title in the description to it, but it's called Chiastic Structuring of the Genesis Flood Story. And in this, he actually builds off the work of some previous scholars, but he identifies 14 separate scenes, which are ultimately 2 combined macro chiasms. And it actually becomes this 2x2 narrative, which he believes is artistically appropriate and likely intentional. If you think of the theme of at least some of the animals that enter the ark, you have that 2x2 theme. And so he sees 2 chiasms that have been combined in a 2x2 narrative by a redactor at a later point. You may be familiar with this as the documentary hypothesis, or the JEPD, but it talks about the J class and the P class both having flood accounts and then a redactor at a later point in time, merging these together in a 2x2 chiasm. And he also states that the scenes are demarked for the most part with a statement concerning either Noah and his sons or a statement of time. And this is actually the overview right here of his chiasm that he identifies within the flood account. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see it builds up to that first 7 right there where you get the flood description. And then you actually get where the waters begin to recede as that 7 descends all the way back down to 1. And it does start out with genealogies going back to chapter 5 as well. And it even carries on to chapter 10 with the genealogies of Noah's son. So this is a giant chiasm, and you can see it extends further than just that flood. You might ask why we spent some time on the literary structure of the flood, and that is because you get this central portion right in here. Now, I do want to point this out. Scholars debate on what the actual central hinge point of the chiasm is, or how the chiasm is structured, but the majority, if not all of the material that I have read on this from books, articles, commentaries, it's all going to place the central hinge point either at the end of chapter 7 or at the beginning of chapter 8, or in the case of the chiasm that you see here on the screen, there are 2 7s which together make that central hinge point, and it's the end of chapter 7 and beginning of chapter 8. And this is where you get the flood description of what actually happened, and this is an important feature when people discuss Was it global or was it regional? This is Genesis 7:19. It says, "And the waters prevailed so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered." And so what you'll get is you'll get this language right here, so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. And so people will say, this is a global catastrophic description of a flood narrative. Therefore, it must be a global event. However, if we examine more than just the English text here, if we actually look into the Hebrew text of this, we're going to see something quite different and maybe have an alternative explanation for this. All right, so we are now in Logos Bible software, and what I've actually done is I have come in here and I've gone to the exegetical guide up here, and I've searched Genesis chapter 7, verse 3, because it uses this language, the whole earth. And that's this phrase that you'll see highlighted right here, this kol haaretz. That is, kol is the word all, haaretz is the phrase the earth. And what you'll find a lot in this discussion on was the flood global or was it regional, people will identify this phrase right here, this word kol, and they will say, because it says kol, which in Hebrew can mean all or whole. And what we can actually do, we can just come over to this side right here where you see the word all, and we can conduct actually a word study, and we'll see exactly how this is used. So here we go. We have kol. It is used over 5,000 times, and this translation is the Lexham Hebrew Bible. And if we can come and select any Bible we want. So if we do the ESV, you can see it's about the same. But you can see the vast majority of the time it does mean all. It can also mean whole, everyone, or everything. So at face value, it does appear that what we have here is the text speaking of all of the earth or the entire globe. However, what we can also do is we can come in and identify this word earth right here to this haaretz in Hebrew, and we can do a biblical word study on this. And we'll actually find the majority of time this is land. There are some times it is earth, but again, if we bridge this gap between our modern understanding of what the earth is in this global sphere that we understand it to be, the ancients didn't have that understanding. They didn't have a spaceship where they could go up and see that it was a globe. And again, I know this is a hot topic, but the vast majority of scholarship is going to fall under the category that this word simply means land. It does not mean globe. And so what you actually have here is you would have the whole land. However, we can do more than just individually study these two words. And what I've actually done is I've come in and I've typed in the phrase kol haaretz, and you can see that this actually gives 19 results. However, that's not all of the times that this phrase is used in the Bible. If you remember, I used the term right here, the kol haaretz. That ha right there, that's just the prefix the. So I've actually done a second search on that, the kol haaretz, and there are 91 results in 90 verses that we find here. And there's other combinations that you can do of this as well. But if I come over here to the Lexham Hebrew Bible, I'm in Genesis chapter 7, and then verse 3, that's that kol haaretz that we see right there. And if I go over to the English Bible, you'll see this is great. It's highlighted. So I can read it in the Hebrew right here, and I see the highlighted text in the English. And I actually have it set to where any word that I highlight, you're going to see it pop up on the other side. And so we actually have this phrase, again, Genesis 7, chapter 3, this is speaking of the flood event. It says, and 7 pairs of birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So again, that does sound global. That sounds global, like it's going to be all of the earth that we know. What I've also done is I've done a search on Joshua 11:16, and I'll come over here to this English Standard Version is here. We see that same phrase, kol haaretz, and you can see it's highlighted on the other side. We can see it in 2 places in Joshua chapter 11, but this second instance in verse 23 is really what we're looking at. See if I scroll up, there we have it too. There's that matching one from verse 16. But we can actually read chapter 23 right here, where it says, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments, and the land had rest from war. Now, if we look at the context, just back to verse 21 of this, we know that Joshua is not taking the entire globe or all of the earth in North America, South America, Antarctica. But we can see clearly here that this phrase kol haaretz does not mean exhaustive totality. So let's come back over to here. This is the same phrase that kol haaretz that we see, or the combination of the words kol and haaretz in Genesis 13 verses 8 and 9. This is when Abram is speaking to Lot, when they're looking out, and Abram's asking Lot which portion of land he wants. And this is what Abram says to Lot: "Is not the whole land before you, the kol haaretz before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Now, from where they are standing, we know that this does not mean the entire globe that they are looking out on. This is a specific area of land, much like we saw in this Joshua 11:23 narrative, where it talked about Joshua taking the whole land, the kol haaretz. We know it is not speaking of the entire globe. There's also one more passage that we'll look at here, and this is from 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 8. And the context for this is when David is actually at war with his son Absalom in the forest of Ephraim. And this is what the verse says: "The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword." Now, this phrase, all the country, is taken from the ESV, but it is that same phrase, kol haaretz. And rather than being land or earth, in this instance, they've translated it as country. But we can clearly see from the context here that it's not referring to the entire globe or the entire earth. It is referring strictly to all of the country within this specific area of the forest of Ephraim. So this is another instance where the phrase kol haaretz does not mean exhaustive totality. Now, another verse that people are going to point to, and in fairness, is going to be Genesis 7:21. And this is a verse that says, "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all mankind." So here again, in all these instances where you see the word all, that is the same word kol that we just looked at. And the big one that people are going to point to here concerning this verse is this phrase, all flesh, in Hebrew, kol basar. But we can actually do the same thing with this, looking into the Hebrew to show that it does not mean exhaustive totality. So we're going to look at this phrase, kol basar, in the book of Ezekiel. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I have the ESV pulled up. And on the left-hand side of the screen, I have the Lexham Hebrew Bible pulled up. But I'm going to provide some context for this. And we're going to start in verse 45 in the ESV. And it says this: "And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face toward the southland. Preach against the south and prophesy against the forest land in the Negev," or the Negeb. In Hebrew, the bet, which acts as this B on the end of Negeb, can be pronounced either as a B sound or a V sound. Continuing on in verse 47, "Say to the forest of the Negev, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I will kindle a fire in you, and it shall devour every green tree in you and every dry tree. The blazing flame shall not be quenched, and all faces from the south to the north shall be scorched by it." And here's the key verse right here, verse 48. "All flesh shall see that I, the Lord, have kindled it. It shall not be quenched." So if we look at this phrase right here, then verse 48, all flesh, this kol basar, that doesn't mean every single person in the world shall see that the Lord has kindled this fire and that it shall not be quenched. It's talking about a very specific geographical area, and the context that we read from verses 45 to 48 make that very clear. So we cannot say that when we see the phrase kol basar, it necessitates exhaustive totality in all of the verses where it is used. And there's one more thing to point out here. Scholars have long recognized this as the Table of Nations, but more specifically that this Table of Nations taken from the genealogical list in Genesis chapter 10 represents the entire known world at the time. And so one idea that is put forth is that if this is the known world at the time of the biblical authors, this would be the specific area or the region that they are referring to when they talk about the biblical flood event. And I do want to make the comment here, there's a lot of great commentary that you can find from a vast expanse of biblical scholarship regarding the flood and its context. You can find numerous books on this. I'm going to reference one because I think it's a wonderful book, really more of an introductory book on this topic, but it's written by two scholars, and I think they provide some valuable insight. And this book is The Lost World of the Flood. It's by Old Testament scholars Tremper Longman III, Dr. Tremper Longman III, and Dr. John Walton. And rather than chapters in this book, they use propositions. And proposition 4 is what you see on the screen right here. It says, the Bible uses hyperbole to describe historic events. And within this proposition number 4, they make this comment. There are historical events behind these hyperbolic statements, but it is hard, if not impossible, to reconstruct these events in detail because the biblical authors are not so much interested in the event itself as their significance for God's relationship with his people. And within this same proposition, they actually quote another scholar, Dr. Lawson Younger, who is a professor of Old Testament Semitic languages and ancient Near Eastern history at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And he's done great work on the conquest narrative in Joshua to show that it is hyperbolic. He's done a lot of work on ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts as well as some Egyptian accounts as well. But this is a quote from Dr. Younger. Just like other ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts, the biblical narrative utilizes hyperbolic stereotyped syntagms to build up the account. And he goes on to use some specific examples from Egyptian history and Egyptian accounts to show this. But ultimately, this builds up to proposition 5 in the book, which is really applying this hyperbolic language to the flood narrative. And this is actually how they conclude when discussing the biblical author's use of hyperbolic language regarding the flood. This is the final sentence of proposition number 5. The description truly is that of a worldwide flood, not a local flood. Though some modern readers don't see it, the original audience would have understood that such a description is hyperbole. And I think this is a fantastic summary point when discussing the biblical account of the flood, specifically relating to what the text actually says. I think that we do have a description of a worldwide flood, not a local flood, as was stated. However, they're using this hyperbolic, exaggerated language to make a theological point, but that it is actually drawing from a real historical account. And that was the point that Dr. Tremper and Dr. Walton made in Proposition 4 when they named it, the Bible uses hyperbole to describe historic events. All right, everyone, I hope this video was informative and provided you with additional information when considering the literary structure of the flood and the interpretation that we can take away when we look at this narrative as the original authors would have intended it to be read or heard and as the original audience would have received it. And we are just scratching the surface of the flood narrative with this video. We'll do plenty more on this topic in the future. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I will link those articles and books that I mentioned earlier. Thanks so much.